Hell's Angel leader married a fat stranger for a deal, unaware that she would change his life. That's how it all begins. A feared biker boss, and a quiet, plus-size stranger he marries in a courthouse for one simple deal. No love, no trust, just a signature. But the moment she steps into his rough, dangerous world, everything flips. This woman, soft-spoken, gentle, the kind people overlook, starts changing the entire gang with nothing but kindness. She cooks for them, bandages their wounds, brings peace where there's usually chaos. And the biker boss, the man no one dares to challenge, finds himself shaken by her courage. But then, something terrifying happens. A rival gang discovers who she is, and a dark figure from her past comes hunting. Suddenly, the deal doesn't feel like a deal anymore. It feels like a trap that could cost both of them everything. When danger closes in, will this tough biker risk his whole world to protect the woman he never meant to love? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now. And if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The Nevada sun beat down mercilessly as Cade Maddox guided his Harley through the dusty streets of Carson City. His weathered leather jacket creaked with each movement, a familiar comfort against the uncertainty churning in his gut. The courthouse loomed ahead, its stone facade a stark reminder of the stakes involved. The letter burning a hole in his pocket had thrown his plans into chaos. The clubhouse expansion, his dream of giving his brothers a real home, hung by a thread. The solution seemed almost laughable. Marry the property's current owner, some librarian named Helen Porter, who was apparently on the run from trouble of her own. Cade parked his bike, boots crunching on gravel as he dismounted. He ran a hand through his dark hair, steeling himself for what he imagined would be a nervous wreck of a woman. Most people who crossed paths with the Hell's Angels chapter were either looking for trouble or running from it. This Helen Porter seemed firmly in the second category. The courthouse interior was cool and quiet, his heavy footsteps echoing off marble floors. That's when he saw her, and every assumption he'd made crumbled. Helen Porter stood at the clerk's counter, her rounded figure held with surprising dignity despite the slight tremor in the hand gripping her worn suitcase. She wore simple clothes, a blue blouse and practical skirt. But there was nothing simple about the quiet strength in her posture. Her eyes met his, warm brown touching steel gray, and Cade felt something shift in the air between them. No fear, just careful assessment. She spoke first, her voice soft but steady. "Mr. Maddox, I presume?" He nodded, closing the distance between them. "Just Cade is fine." Up close, he could see the fading yellow of an old bruise near her temple, partially hidden by her honey-brown hair. Her jaw tightened. "You understand what we're doing here?" "Perfectly." Helen's fingers relaxed slightly on her suitcase handle. "You need the land rights. I need somewhere safe to stay. Marriage of convenience, as they used to say in the old books." A ghost of a smile touched her lips at that, and Cade found himself wondering what other surprises this librarian might hold. "My guys can be rough around the edges," he warned, "but they'll keep you safe." "I trust you'll make that clear to them." It wasn't a question, and Cade felt an unexpected spark of respect at her quiet confidence. The ceremony itself was brief, performed by a judge who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Helen's "I do" was clear and firm. Cade's came out gruffer than he intended, the unfamiliar weight of commitment settling around his shoulders. The ride to the clubhouse was interesting. Helen sat behind him on the Harley, her arms wrapped securely around his waist without hesitation. She'd traded her skirt for jeans before they left, practical even in this. The usual crowd of bikers lounged outside the clubhouse as they pulled up, a converted warehouse that had seen better days. Whistles and catcalls started immediately. "Hey, boss. Brought us a new mama?" Tank, one of his younger members, called out with a grin. Before Cade could snap at them, Helen stepped off the bike with surprising grace. She brushed down her clothes, lifted her chin, and addressed the group directly. "Good afternoon, gentlemen. Would any of you be kind enough to help with my bags?" The silence that followed was almost comical. These were men who solved most problems with their fists, who prided themselves on their toughness. Yet something in Helen's gentle authority made three of them scramble to assist her. Cade watched, fighting back an amused smirk as his hardened brothers carefully handled Helen's modest luggage. She thanked each one by name. She must have been paying attention when he'd introduced them, and somehow managed to make them stand a little straighter with just her appreciation. The inside of the clubhouse was exactly what you'd expect: motorcycle parts, empty bottles, and general chaos. Helen took it in without comment, following Cade up the metal stairs to his private room. He realized, too late, that he hadn't cleaned in. Well, he couldn't remember when. Helen stepped inside, her eyes scanning the scattered clothes, unmade bed, and cluttered surfaces. There was a long moment of silence. Then she turned to him, those warm brown eyes holding a mix of determination and something that might have been amusement. "If we're doing this," she said quietly, "we're starting with cleaning." Cade opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again. There was something in her tone that made him realize this wasn't just about the mess. This was about establishing their new normal, about making space in his chaos for her presence. He watched as she set down her suitcase and began rolling up her sleeves. This woman, who had just fled from danger, who had married a stranger, was somehow making his personal space her first battle for order. And strangest of all, he found himself wanting to help her win it. "Where do we start?" he heard himself ask, and the smile she gave him in return was worth every ounce of wounded pride. Throughout the afternoon, Cade discovered that Helen's gentle authority extended to housekeeping. She didn't bark orders, but suggested and guided, turning what could have been a chore into something almost companionable. When she found his prized motorcycle manual collection scattered across the floor, she carefully organized them by make and year, handling each book with the reverence of a true librarian. The transformation of his room mirrored the subtle shift happening between them. Not romance, not yet, but something like respect beginning to take root. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the window, Cade looked around at the now organized space and felt something he hadn't expected. Possibility. The morning sun had barely begun to peek through the dusty windows of the Hells Angels clubhouse when Helen Porter woke. She had spent an uncomfortable night on the old couch in Cade's now clean room, while he took the floor despite her protests. Her back ached, but her determination didn't waver. The kitchen was exactly what she expected: a disaster zone of epic proportions. Empty pizza boxes competed for space with crusty plates and mysterious stains that might have been there since the building was new. Helen took a deep breath, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. She found an ancient coffee maker buried under a stack of takeout containers. After scrubbing it thoroughly, she managed to get it working, filling the stale air with the rich aroma of fresh coffee. As she worked, she hummed softly, an old habit that helped her focus and stay calm. The sound of heavy footsteps made her turn. Cade stood in the doorway, his hair mussed from sleep, staring at her as if she were some kind of apparition. She supposed she was, a plus-size librarian in an oversized sweater, attacking decades of grime with dollar store cleaning supplies. "Good morning," she said cheerfully, pouring him a cup of coffee. "I hope you don't mind, but I thought the kitchen needed some attention." Cade took the coffee wordlessly, his eyes tracking her movements as she returned to scrubbing the stovetop. The silence stretched between them until Helen started humming again, a quiet tune that seemed to ease the tension in the room. "You don't have to do this," he finally said, his voice rough with sleep. Helen paused in her scrubbing. "I know. But I'd like to eat breakfast without wondering what might be living in the toaster." A snort of surprised laughter escaped him, and Helen counted it as a small victory. As the morning progressed, more bikers began filtering into the kitchen, drawn by the unfamiliar scent of coffee and cleaning products. Helen had managed to find some eggs and bread that weren't completely past saving, and soon the sound of sizzling filled the air. "Who wants breakfast?" she asked, holding up a spatula like a conductor's baton. The men exchanged uncertain glances until one brave soul, Tank, she remembered, stepped forward. "Yes, ma'am, I'd eat." Soon she was serving plates of scrambled eggs to a growing crowd of bewildered bikers. The scene might have been comical if it weren't so touching. These tough men perched on various surfaces, eating her simple breakfast with something like wonder on their faces. "Hey, that was my piece of toast." A scuffle broke out between two members, Bear and Rusty, if she remembered correctly. Helen turned from the stove, fixing them with her best librarian stare. "Gentlemen, there's plenty more bread. No need to fight over it. Bear, please pass the butter to Rusty after you're done with it." The men froze mid-struggle, looking sheepish. "Yes, ma'am," they mumbled in unison. From his corner, Cade watched the scene unfold with an expression Helen couldn't quite read. She offered him a small smile before turning back to the stove. Later that morning, she noticed one of the younger members, Joey, trying to hide his bloodied knuckles. "Let me see that," she said firmly, leaving no room for argument. Joey reluctantly extended his hand, revealing split skin and nascent bruising. As she cleaned the wound with supplies from her personal first aid kit, she asked, "What happened?" "Trying to fix my bike," he admitted. "Used a beer bottle as a hammer when I couldn't find my tools." Helen shook her head, dabbing antiseptic on the cuts. "That's not what bottles are for. There must be proper tools around here somewhere." "In the workshop," Cade supplied unexpectedly from behind her. "I'll show you where they are, Joey." The afternoon brought a brief respite from the chaos. Helen retrieved her old church hymnal from her suitcase, a comfort object she'd carried with her through all her troubles. She found a worn picnic bench outside the clubhouse and settled in to read. The familiar words brought peace to her heart as she read softly to herself. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want." The sound of shuffling feet made her glance up. Several bikers had found reasons to linger nearby, one working on his bike, another smoking, a third supposedly checking his phone. All within earshot. She didn't comment on their presence, just continued reading quietly, letting the ancient words of comfort fill the space between them. As evening approached, Cade finally confronted her. He found her outside, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and orange. "You're taking over," he said bluntly, crossing his arms over his chest. Helen turned to face him, her expression calm. "That's not my intention," she replied softly. "I'm just trying to bring a little peace where I can. Sometimes that means clean dishes and hot coffee. Sometimes it means bandaging wounds or stopping fights over toast. This isn't some church social you can fix with kindness," Cade growled, but his tone lacked real anger. "No," Helen agreed. "It's a home. Your home. And now temporarily at least mine too. I can't help wanting to make it better, even in small ways." Her words seemed to catch him off guard. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then turned and walked away without responding. Long after Helen had gone inside, Cade sat alone on the clubhouse steps, watching the last traces of sunlight fade from the sky. The warmth that seemed to radiate from Helen's presence had him confused. It wasn't just the cleaning or the cooking. It was the way she handled his men with gentle firmness, the way she treated their rough edges with respect instead of fear or judgment. He couldn't remember the last time the clubhouse had felt so much like a home. The thought both comforted and unsettled him as darkness settled over the compound. Dawn painted the Nevada desert in soft pastels as Helen followed Cade across the property line. The morning air still held a hint of coolness, though the sun promised another scorching day ahead. Helen wrapped her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, watching Cade's broad back as he led the way. "This here's where we're thinking of putting the new workshop," Cade said, gesturing to a flat stretch of land. His voice held a gruff pride as he outlined invisible walls with his hands. Garage doors would face east, office space along the back wall. Helen stepped carefully through the desert scrub, considering the space. "What about natural light?" she asked. "If you added windows along the north side, you'd get good light all day without the heat." Cade turned to look at her, surprise evident in his expression. "You know about construction?" "I helped design the children's reading room at my library," she explained with a small smile. "Had to learn about lighting and space planning, and my father was a contractor. I picked up a few things." He nodded slowly, reassessing the area. North-facing windows could work, save on electricity too. They continued walking the property, Helen asking questions about drainage and access roads that made Cade look at her with increasing interest. Neither noticed the glint of binoculars from a distant ridge, where a scout from the rival Demon Riders gang watched intently. The scout pressed his radio. "Boss, got eyes on Maddox. He's with some woman. Chunky brunette, looks soft, acting mighty comfortable with her." Static crackled before a voice responded. "Get a good look. We need details." Back at the clubhouse, Helen threw herself into organizing with quiet determination. She sorted through piles of laundry that had accumulated in corners, separated clean from dirty, and started a washing machine humming. The noise of motorcycle engines and rough male voices that usually filled the clubhouse seemed muted today, as if the space itself was holding its breath. In the main room, she assembled a wooden bookshelf she'd found abandoned in a storage closet. After wiping away years of dust, she carefully arranged a small collection of books, some from her own collection, others salvaged from around the clubhouse. When she carried it into Cade's room, she found him watching from the doorway. "Just thought it might be nice," she said softly, setting the shelf against the wall. "Everyone should have some books nearby." His expression softened almost imperceptibly. "You don't quit, do you?" "Not when something matters," she replied, straightening a row of paperbacks. Throughout the day, Cade's men whispered among themselves as Helen moved through the clubhouse with quiet purpose. Tank nudged Bear after winning an unusually large hand of poker. "She's good luck, man. Since she showed up, everything's just smoother." Even Cade felt it, the subtle shift in the clubhouse's atmosphere. He caught himself almost smiling as he watched Helen show Joey how to properly fold sheets. The piece was so foreign, it almost made him uncomfortable. But that piece shattered when his phone buzzed late that afternoon. The text from his most reliable informant made his blood run cold. "Demon Riders asking questions about your new wife. They're digging." Cade found Helen in the kitchen, stirring a pot of something that smelled like heaven. The sight of her there, humming softly as she cooked, made his chest tight with an unfamiliar protectiveness. "Helen," he said quietly, pulling out a chair at the small table. "We need to talk." She turned, wooden spoon in hand, reading something in his expression that made her lower the heat on the stove and sit across from him. "Is there anyone," he began carefully, "from your past who might want to hurt you? Anyone who might be Connected to certain types of people? Helen's hands trembled slightly as she folded them on the table. Marcus, she whispered after a long moment. My ex. He's not a good man, Cade. He has connections. Drug dealers, criminals. When I left him, he said he'd find me. She swallowed hard. He's smart and manipulative. And when he's angry... The fear in her voice made Cade's jaw clench. He'd seen plenty of violence in his life, had dealt out his fair share, but the thought of someone hurting Helen made rage curl hot in his stomach. You're safe here, he said firmly. No one's going to touch you. Helen nodded, but her eyes held shadows. That's what scares me most, she admitted. He won't just hurt me. He'll hurt anyone who tries to help me. Later that night, after the clubhouse had settled into relative quiet, Cade made his rounds. He checked every door, every window, his hand brushing the pistol he'd tucked into his waistband. The weight of the gun was familiar, but tonight it felt more necessary than ever. He paused outside Helen's door, listening to her soft, steady breathing from across the hall. The woman who'd brought warmth and order to his chaotic world now needed his protection. Cade resumed his patrol, each step more determined than the last. He'd been fighting his whole life, but now, for the first time in years, he had something truly worth defending. Dawn crept over the horizon, painting the clubhouse in shades of gray and gold. The morning air hung heavy with tension as Cade paced the main room, his boots making dull thuds against the worn floorboards. From the kitchen came the familiar sounds of Helen at work, the sizzle of bacon, the crack of eggs, the soft humming that had become part of their morning routine. Everyone outside, Cade barked as his men filtered in, drawn by the smell of breakfast. Mandatory meeting, now. The bikers exchanged worried glances. Mandatory meetings usually meant trouble. They filed out onto the gravel lot where their bikes gleamed in the early light. Cade stood before them, his face hard as stone. Listen up, he began, voice low and serious. We've got a situation. Rivals are asking questions about Helen. They're digging for information, and that means they're planning something. He paused, making eye contact with each man. From this moment on, no one, and I mean no one, mentions that Helen lives here. If anyone asks, you don't know her. You've never seen her. Understood? Tank, the largest of the group, stepped forward. Boss, what exactly are we dealing with here? Cade ran a hand through his hair. Could be nothing. Could be everything. Her ex has connections. Bad ones. And now the demon riders are sniffing around, too. She's worth protecting, Bear spoke up, surprising everyone. Lady's brought nothing but good since she got here. Damn right, Cade agreed firmly. She's family now, and we protect our own. Unknown to them, Helen had stepped onto the back porch, a dish towel in her hands. She froze at Cade's words, her heart skipping a beat. Family. The word echoed in her mind, bringing unexpected tears to her eyes. She'd been alone for so long, running and hiding. The concept of family felt foreign, dangerous even, but somehow right. Confused by the surge of emotions, Helen retreated to the kitchen. By the time the men came in for breakfast, she had composed herself, but her hands trembled slightly as she served plates piled high with eggs, bacon, and toast. Later that afternoon, Cade found Helen making a grocery list. We need supplies, she explained, not meeting his eyes. The pantry's nearly empty. I'll take you, he said immediately. Not safe for you to go alone? The ride into town was quiet. Helen's arms wrapped tentatively around Cade's waist as the Harley rumbled beneath them. At the grocery store, Cade stayed close, his presence both comforting and unnerving as Helen pushed the cart down each aisle. She checked prices carefully, choosing store brands and sale items. Get whatever you want, Cade told her, adding name-brand coffee to the cart when she reached for the cheaper, option. We can afford it. Helen paused in the baking aisle, her fingers trailing over a box of cake mix. The guys mentioned liking chocolate, she said softly. Then get chocolate, Cade replied, his gruff voice gentler than usual. After loading the groceries into the saddlebags, Cade surprised her by pulling into the parking lot of a small diner. You need to eat, he said simply, holding the door open for her. The waitress brought them each a slice of apple pie, still warm from the oven. Helen took a bite and closed her eyes, savoring the sweetness. When she opened them, she found Cade watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Thank you, she said. And then, for the first time since he'd known her, she laughed. It was a small sound, barely more than a giggle, but it transformed her face, making her eyes sparkle. Cade felt something shift in his chest, but before he could respond, movement caught his eye. Through the window he spotted a familiar face, a demon rider, phone raised, taking pictures. We need to go, he said sharply, throwing cash on the table. Now. Helen's laughter died instantly at his tone. They rushed to the bike, and Cade drove faster than usual, taking back roads and checking his mirrors constantly. When they finally reached the clubhouse, he immediately called his men together. Double the watch, he ordered. I want eyes on every approach. Nobody gets within a mile of this place without us knowing. Helen stood in the doorway, watching as the men dispersed to their posts. The reality of her situation hit her anew. These men were risking their lives to protect her. The danger she'd fled had followed her here, threatening not just her, but everyone who'd shown her kindness. Night fell slowly, bringing with it a heavy silence. In her borrowed room, Helen sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly. Lord, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I need your strength now more than ever. Please protect these men who've protected me, and please. She hesitated. Please keep Cade safe. Outside her door, Cade stood guard, his back against the wall and his hand near his weapon. The simple marriage deal had evolved into something far more complicated. Now it wasn't just about land or a business arrangement. It was about keeping Helen safe. And as he listened to her soft prayers through the door, he realized he'd fight anyone who tried to harm her. The early morning light had barely touched the clubhouse windows when Helen stirred awake to the sound of confused male voices drifting from the kitchen. She lay still for a moment, listening to the unfamiliar cadence of men trying to be quiet. No, man. She wrote it right here. Measure the water first, one voice muttered. Since when do we measure anything? Another grumbled back. Since Helen put up these rules, that's when. You want to be the one to mess up her kitchen? Helen pressed her hand to her mouth to hide her smile. Just yesterday, she'd taped a neat list of basic kitchen rules to the refrigerator, hoping to prevent another incident like the pasta disaster from the day before. She hadn't expected anyone to actually read them, let alone try to follow them. Pulling on her robe, she padded down the hallway toward the common area. The sight that greeted her stopped her in her tracks. 5 grown men, still in their leather vests despite the early hour, crowded around a pot on the stove. The counter was dusted with spilled oatmeal, and someone had definitely used too much water. It was sloshing over the sides as Bear, the largest of the bunch, stirred vigorously. You're supposed to add the oats after the water boils, Helen said, unable to contain her laughter any longer. They all jumped, looking guilty as schoolboys caught passing notes. We were trying to surprise you, admitted Tank, scratching his beard sheepishly. Guess we're not much good at cooking. Here, Helen said warmly, moving to the stove. Let me show you. First, we'll start fresh. This is too watery to save. For the next hour, Helen guided them through the basics of making oatmeal. She showed them how to measure properly, when to add the oats, and how to tell when it was done. By the time they finished, Every man had successfully made his own bowl, topped with brown sugar and raisins. "This ain't half bad," Bear admitted, scooping up another spoonful. "Wait until you learn how to make pancakes," Helen promised, and their faces lit up like Christmas had come early. After breakfast, Helen pulled out a large piece of paper and some markers. "Time to get organized," she announced, creating a neat grid. "A chore chart will help keep the place running smoothly." To her surprise, there were few complaints. The men actually seemed eager to claim their tasks, though there was some good-natured arguing over who got the easier jobs. Helen noticed they all steered clear of bathroom duty until she gently reminded them that everyone needed to take turns. Throughout the morning, she moved from room to room, setting things right. She bandaged Tank's hand after he caught it in a cabinet door, applied antibiotic cream to Bear's scraped elbow, and helped Tiny, who was anything but, find his missing reading glasses. They'd been on top of his head the whole time. Around noon, Helen ventured onto the back patio and stopped short. The concrete was stained with what she strongly suspected was blood, along with oil and other substances she'd rather not identify. She found Cade in his office, going over paperwork. "The patio needs scrubbing," she said without preamble. Cade looked up, his expression guarded. "Leave it." "It's not good for morale," Helen countered softly. "Living amongst stains like that, it affects people, whether they realize it or not." Cade studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "Fine, but I'm helping. Some of those stains might need explaining." They spent the next 2 hours on their hands and knees, scrubbing the concrete with brushes and a strong cleaning solution. Helen didn't ask about the stains, and Cade didn't volunteer information. But as they worked side by side, something shifted between them. "You missed a spot," Helen teased at one point, pointing to a perfectly clean section of concrete. Cade flicked some soapy water at her, surprising them both. Helen's eyes widened for a moment before she laughed, a real, full laugh that seemed to brighten the whole patio. The corner of Cade's mouth twitched up in what might have been a smile. By late afternoon, Helen had tackled the kitchen again, this time assembling a massive lasagna. The smell of garlic bread and tomato sauce drew the men like moths to a flame. When she finally set the food out, they descended on it as if they hadn't eaten in days. "Slow down," she chided gently. "There's plenty more." Cade watched from his usual spot at the head of the table. Something unfamiliar stirred in his chest as he observed Helen moving among his men, refilling plates, wiping sauce from Bear's beard with a napkin, listening to Tank's story about his mother's cooking with genuine interest. The clubhouse felt different, warmer somehow, more like. His thoughts were interrupted as Helen finished cleaning up and wandered toward the corner of the room. There stood an old upright piano, its surface thick with dust. She ran her fingers along the wooden lid, leaving trails in the gray coating. "I didn't know this was here," she said softly, lifting the lid to reveal the keys. Her finger pressed down on middle C, the note ringing slightly out of tune through the room. "I used to play, you know, before—" She didn't finish the sentence, but her fingers lingered on the keys. From his position in the doorway, where he'd followed her without really meaning to, Cade watched as she touched the piano with the same gentle care she'd shown everything else in his world. The single note hung in the air between them, like a question neither was ready to ask. The next morning dawned crisp and clear. Cade rose before sunrise, careful not to wake anyone as he crept through the clubhouse. He paused briefly outside Helen's door, listening to her soft breathing, before continuing to the garage where he kept his truck. The old piano had bothered him all night. Not the piano itself, but the way Helen's fingers had hovered over those dusty keys. the longing in her voice when she'd mentioned playing. He knew a guy, Old Joe, who fixed up instruments in his workshop outside town. It wouldn't hurt to ask. Getting the piano loaded was a challenge. Cade wrapped it carefully in moving blankets, securing it with straps. His muscles strained as he used a dolly to wheel it up the ramp into his pickup truck. By the time he finished, sweat dampened his shirt despite the morning chill. Back in the clubhouse, Helen woke to find Cade gone. She started her usual morning routine, brewing coffee and setting out breakfast fixings. Around mid-morning, she noticed Snake, one of the younger bikers, struggling with a newspaper, holding it upside down and squinting. "Everything all right?" she asked gently, setting a fresh cup of coffee beside him. Snake jumped, quickly folding the paper. "Fine," he mumbled, but his ears had turned red. Helen sat down across from him. "Snake," she said softly, "can you read?" The big man's shoulders slumped. "Not really," he admitted. "Never got the hang of it in school. Teacher said I was too stupid to learn." "That's nonsense," Helen replied firmly. "Would you like me to help you?" Snake looked up, surprise and hope warring on his face. "You'd do that?" "Of course. We can start right now if you'd like." For the next several hours, Helen sat with Snake at the kitchen table, patiently working through basic phonics. Other bikers drifted in and out, pretending not to listen as she helped him sound out words. "See how these letters work together?" she explained, pointing to the page. "Like pieces of a puzzle. You're doing wonderfully." Snake's face lit up when he successfully read his first complete sentence. "I did it!" he exclaimed, then looked embarrassed at his own excitement. "You absolutely did," Helen beamed. "Should we try another?" By afternoon, 2 more bikers had quietly joined their impromptu reading lesson. Helen's heart swelled as she watched these tough men concentrate on forming simple words, their faces screwed up in determination. Meanwhile, Cade sat in Old Joe's cluttered workshop, watching the elderly repairman examine the piano. "It's fixable," Joe declared finally. "Needs new felt hammers, some strings replaced, thorough tuning. Gonna take all day, though." "Whatever it costs," Cade said gruffly. "Just make it play right." Joe's weathered face crinkled in a knowing smile. "Must be some special lady to have you hauling pianos around." Cade just grunted, but he stayed all day, watching Joe's skilled hands bring the instrument back to life. As the sun began to set, the old repairman played a few experimental chords. "There you go," he said, patting the restored piano. "Good as new." The drive back to the clubhouse seemed longer than usual. Cade's stomach felt strangely tight as he pulled up to the building. Several bikers rushed out to help unload, word spreading quickly through the clubhouse. Helen was in the kitchen when she heard the commotion. She stepped into the main room just as Cade and the others wheeled in the piano, her piano, now gleaming with fresh polish, its brass pedals shining in the evening light. "Oh!" The sound escaped her throat as her hands flew to her mouth. "Cade, you didn't—" "Thought it needed fixing," he said gruffly, avoiding her eyes. "That's all." Helen approached the piano slowly, running her fingers over the smooth wood. When she pressed a key, the note rang out pure and clear. Tears welled in her eyes. "Play something," Snake called out, and the other bikers joined in, encouraging her. Helen sat at the bench, and after a moment's hesitation, Cade lowered himself beside her. She was acutely aware of his solid presence, the warmth of his shoulder against hers. Her fingers trembled slightly as she began to play Amazing Grace. The familiar hymn filled the room, soft and sweet. The bikers grew quiet, some sinking into chairs, others leaning against walls. Even the air seemed to still. Helen closed her eyes, letting the music flow through her. feeling Cade's steady presence beside her. For these precious moments, there were no contracts or complications, just the simple connection of shared peace. The last note was still fading when the front door burst open. Hammer, one of their scouts, stumbled in, breathing hard. "Boss," he gasped. "Got word from our contact in the Scorpions. Helen's ex. He's there. He's joined up with them. They're planning something." The peaceful spell shattered. Cade stood slowly, his jaw clenching as he looked down at the piano where Helen's hands had frozen on the keys. The warmth of just moments ago evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard reality. Their brief respite was over. War was coming. Dawn broke over the clubhouse with an unsettling quiet. Cade paced the common room, his boots heavy on the worn floorboards. He'd been up most of the night, planning, worrying. The news about Helen's ex joining forces with the Scorpions changed everything. Helen emerged from the kitchen with 2 steaming coffee mugs. "You look like you haven't slept," she said softly, offering him one. Cade took the cup, but set it aside. "We need to talk." His voice was gruff with exhaustion. "From now on, you don't leave the clubhouse without me. Not even to check the mail or water those flowers you planted." Helen's spine stiffened. "Cade, I understand the danger, but I can't live like a prisoner. This isn't up for discussion." He ran a hand through his hair. "These men, they're not just thugs. They're organized, dangerous. And now they've got your ex feeding them information about you." Several bikers filtered into the room, their usual morning banter subdued. Snake took up position by the front window, his hand never far from his weapon. The whole clubhouse felt like a powder keg waiting for a spark. Throughout the morning, Helen tried to maintain some normalcy. She baked bread, organized supplies, and tended to the daily needs of the men. But her movements were careful, measured, like a bird in a cage testing its boundaries. By afternoon, the tension had everyone on edge. Even the air felt thick with anticipation. Cade stationed men at every entrance, their eyes scanning the street for unfamiliar vehicles. Helen was arranging books on her small shelf when she heard it, the screech of tires on pavement, multiple vehicles moving fast. Before she could process what was happening, the windows exploded inward in a shower of glass and gunfire. "Get down!" Cade's voice boomed across the chaos. He sprinted toward Helen, tackling her behind an overturned oak table as bullets splintered the wood around them. The clubhouse erupted into mayhem. Gunshots cracked through the air, accompanied by shouts and the smell of cordite. Helen pressed her hands over her ears, her heart hammering against her ribs. Cade's body sheltered her, solid and protective. "Stay here," he ordered, then rolled away to join his men in defending their home. Smoke began filling the room. One of the bullets had struck something flammable. Helen could hear the crackle of flames mixing with the gunfire. Through gaps in the overturned furniture, she watched the bikers return fire through broken windows, their faces set in grim determination. Then she heard a cry of pain that made her blood run cold. Big Mike, one of Cade's oldest friends, collapsed near the door, clutching his chest. Blood seeped between his fingers. The attackers' vehicles roared away, leaving behind a devastating silence broken only by the sound of spreading flames and Big Mike's labored breathing. Helen scrambled out from behind the table. "I need towels," she shouted, running to Mike's side, "and the first aid kit from the kitchen." Her hands shook as she assessed the wound, tears streaming down her face. The bullet had entered just below his collarbone. "Stay with me, Mike," she pleaded, applying pressure to slow the bleeding. Cade barked orders to his men, some chasing down the fire with extinguishers, others securing the perimeter. But his eyes kept returning to Helen, covered in Mike's blood, working desperately to save his friend. When the ambulance finally arrived, Helen's face was streaked with tears and soot. She watched them load Mike onto a stretcher, his normally booming voice now weak, as he tried to joke about getting some rest. The fire left one wall of the clubhouse charred and smoking. Broken glass and bullet casings littered the floor. But it was the weight of guilt in Helen's eyes that hit Cade hardest. She stood in the midst of the destruction, arms wrapped around herself, looking small and lost. "This is my fault," she whispered. "They came because of me." Cade watched her for a long moment, his heart heavy with the decision he'd been wrestling with since the first shot was fired. He couldn't protect her here. Not anymore. Later that night, after the chaos had been somewhat contained, and word came that Mike was stable after surgery, Cade found Helen in their room. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing. "Helen." His voice was gentle but firm. "You have to leave." She looked up at him, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "What?" "First thing tomorrow morning. I'm sending you somewhere safe, somewhere they can't find you." The words felt like gravel in his throat. "It's the only way." Helen's quiet crying was the only sound in the room. Each tear felt like an accusation to Cade, but he forced himself to stand firm. Her safety mattered more than anything else, more than the land, more than his growing feelings for her, more than his own heart breaking as he watched her cry. The sun crept over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed to mock the heaviness in Cade's heart. He stood in the parking lot of the clubhouse, his calloused hands gripping Helen's worn suitcase, the same one she'd arrived with just days ago. The morning air was crisp, carrying the lingering scent of smoke from yesterday's attack. Helen emerged from the clubhouse, wrapped in a sweater that seemed too big for her frame. Her eyes were red-rimmed from a sleepless night, but she held her head high. She'd spent the early hours writing thank-you notes to each of the men, tucking them under coffee mugs and between motorcycle manuals. The bikers who were awake stood in the doorway, shuffling their feet awkwardly. None of them knew quite what to say. Big Mike was still in the hospital, and his absence made the morning feel even more somber. "Ready?" Cade asked softly, his voice rougher than usual. Helen nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She climbed into the passenger seat of Cade's truck, while he secured her suitcase in the back. The leather seats creaked as he settled behind the wheel, and the engine rumbled to life, breaking the morning silence. They drove in heavy quiet. Helen stared out the window, watching the familiar streets of their small Nevada town give way to open road. Her fingers twisted in her lap, wanting to reach for Cade's hand but knowing she shouldn't. She felt abandoned, even though logic told her this was for her safety. The thought that Cade regretted their hasty marriage grew stronger with each passing mile. Cade's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Every fiber of his being screamed to turn the truck around, to take her back to the clubhouse where he could protect her. But yesterday's attack played on repeat in his mind. The gunfire, the blood, Helen's tears as she tried to save Mike's life. He couldn't risk her getting hurt. This was the right thing to do, even if it felt like tearing out his own heart. The safe house belonged to Sarah Martinez, a kind-faced woman who attended the local church. She lived on a quiet street in a neighboring town, far enough away from the chaos of their world. The house was small but neat, with cheerful yellow curtains in the windows and flowering bushes along the walkway. Cade carried Helen's suitcase to the front door. Sarah greeted them warmly, but her eyes held understanding of the pain etched on both their faces. She squeezed Helen's hand and promised to take good care of her, then tactfully stepped inside to give them a moment alone. Helen turned to Cade, her lower lip trembling. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything." The words felt inadequate for all he'd done, protecting her, fixing the piano, showing her kindness in his own gruff way. She hugged him weakly, her arms barely circling his broad chest. Cade stood frozen, wanting to pull her close, but knowing if he did, he might never let go. Helen stepped back, gave him one last look that broke his heart, then walked through the door and closed it gently behind her. Cade stood on the porch, staring at the closed door. His feet seemed rooted to the spot. Every step back to his truck felt like walking through quicksand. The drive back to the clubhouse was a blur, his mind still at that yellow house with its cheerful curtains and the woman he'd left behind. The clubhouse felt wrong without Helen. Empty coffee mugs sat unwashed in the sink. Her chore chart hung untouched on the wall, little check marks noting yesterday's completed tasks. Someone had tried to make breakfast, but the burned smell lingering in the air was nothing like the warm, welcoming scents that usually greeted them each morning. The men were restless, angry. The attack had shaken them, and Helen's absence left a void none of them had expected to feel so deeply. Arguments broke out throughout the day, voices rising as they debated retaliation. "We can't let them get away with this," shouted Snake, pacing the common room. "They shot up our home, put Mike in the hospital." "And what about Helen?" countered another biker. "Going after them puts her at more risk." Cade let them argue, retreating to the quiet of his room. Helen's presence lingered here too, in the organized bookshelf, the freshly washed curtains, the small potted plant she'd placed on the windowsill. He caught himself listening for her humming, the soft sound of pages turning, the gentle way she'd scold the men for tracking mud inside. As night fell, Cade found himself drawn to the piano. It stood silent in the corner, sheet music still open to the last hymn she'd played. His fingers hovered over the keys before pressing one note, letting it ring out in the empty room. He could almost see her there, shoulders relaxed as she played, bringing peace to their chaos. Miles away, in the safe house with its yellow curtains, Helen lay curled on her borrowed bed. Tears soaked her pillow as she hugged herself tightly. Sarah had been kind, offering tea and gentle conversation, but nothing could fill the ache in her chest. She missed the rumble of motorcycles, the rough laughter of the men, the way Cade would watch her when he thought she wasn't looking. Both of them lay awake that night, separated by miles but sharing the same pain. Helen convinced herself that Cade regretted their marriage, that she'd brought nothing but trouble to his life. And Cade, surrounded by the reminders of her brief presence in his world, tortured himself with the belief that pushing her away was the only way to keep her safe, even if it meant losing the best thing that had ever happened to him. The piano key's lingering note faded into silence, just as their brief time together seemed to be fading into memory. The morning sun crept through the clubhouse windows, illuminating empty coffee cups and unwashed dishes piling in the sink. Cade sat at the kitchen table, staring at Helen's neat handwriting on the chore chart. His coffee had gone cold, untouched like the plate of burnt eggs someone had attempted to make. In the common room, two of his men were already arguing about motorcycle parts, their voices growing louder with each exchange. Without Helen's gentle intervention, these spats had been escalating all morning. "That's my wrench, you thick-headed," Snake's voice carried through the hallway. "Like hell it is," came the response, followed by the clatter of tools hitting the floor. Cade pinched the bridge of his nose, feeling a headache building. He'd forgotten how chaotic the clubhouse could be. Or maybe he'd just gotten used to the peace Helen brought with her presence. Standing up, he strode into the common room just as the argument turned physical. "Enough," he barked, separating the two men. "You're acting like children." Snake spat on the floor, something Helen would have scolded him for, and stomped outside, The other man kicked the scattered tools, making the mess worse. Cade looked around at his domain. The clubhouse had descended into its former state in less than 24 hours. Pizza boxes littered the coffee table. Someone had spilled beer on the couch, and cigarette butts dotted the floor instead of making it to the ashtrays Helen had strategically placed around the room. Unable to bear the suffocating atmosphere inside, Cade walked out to the back lot. The morning air was cool against his face as he leaned against his Harley. His eyes fell on the wooden bench where Helen used to sit and read her Bible in the afternoons. Something tugged at his heart, a feeling he couldn't name. Before he knew what he was doing, Cade found himself looking up at the sky, hands shoved deep in his pockets. He started, feeling foolish. He'd never prayed before, not really. I don't know if you're listening. Helen seems to think you are. He cleared his throat. I need direction, help, something. The words felt clumsy on his tongue, but he pressed on. I sent her away to keep her safe, but everything's falling apart. The men are at each other's throats. The clubhouse is a mess. He paused, admitting in a lower voice. I miss her. Miles away, in the pastor's home, Helen stood in a warm kitchen, helping Martha knead bread dough. Flour dusted her arms up to her elbows, and the familiar motion should have been soothing. Instead, each press of her hands into the dough only reminded her of mornings spent baking for the bikers. You're doing wonderfully, dear, Martha said kindly, noticing Helen's distant expression. Would you like to try the cinnamon rolls next? Helen attempted a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. That would be nice, she said softly, though her heart wasn't in it. She'd made cinnamon rolls for the clubhouse just 3 days ago. Snake had eaten 4 of them in one sitting, looking sheepish, when she'd caught him reaching for a 5th. The ache in her chest had become a constant companion. She missed the rumble of motorcycles, the gruff voices that had become familiar, the way the men would try to clean up after themselves, usually failing but earnestly trying to please her. Most of all, she missed Cade's steady presence, the way he'd watch over everything with those intense eyes of his. From the next room, she heard Pastor Jim's voice drift through the partially open door. He was on the phone, speaking in low tones, but certain words caught her attention. Rival gang spotted again, searching for Cade's new wife, getting bold in their attempts. Helen's hands stilled in the dough. Her heart began to race as the implications sank in. The rivals weren't just after her. They were actively hunting her, which meant Cade and the others were still in danger. Her leaving hadn't protected them at all. If anything, it had left them more vulnerable, separated and divided. Back at the clubhouse, Cade was heading inside when his phone rang. The number belonged to one of his most reliable informants. His gut tightened as he answered. Talk to me. The news made his blood run cold. The rival gang had been spotted in 3 different towns, showing Helen's picture around, asking questions. They weren't just looking for her. They were hunting her methodically, systematically. It was only a matter of time before they found the right person who knew where she was. Cade's hands began to shake, not from fear, but from a rage so deep it threatened to consume him. He'd sent her away to protect her, but he'd only succeeded in making her more vulnerable. Away from the clubhouse, away from his men, away from him, she was an easier target. The guilt hit him like a physical blow. He'd abandoned her. No matter his intentions, that's what it came down to. He'd promised to protect her, and instead he'd left her alone. Striding into the common room, Cade found most of his men gathered there, still bickering about various grievances. The sight of their disarray, their lack of focus, sparked something in him. This wasn't who they were. This wasn't what Helen had helped them become. Listen up, his voice cut through the chaos like a blade. The room fell silent as every head turned toward him. Cade planted his hands on the table, leaning forward with purpose burning in his eyes. The rivals are still hunting for Helen. They're getting closer every day. And what are we doing? Fighting like children, falling apart without her here. He looked each man in the eye. She made us better. She brought peace to this chaos, and we let her go. The men shifted uncomfortably, guilt evident on their faces. They all knew it was true. Cade's fist came down hard on the table, the sharp crack making everyone jump. His voice carried the weight of absolute authority as he declared, "We're bringing her home." The words hung in the air, heavy with promise and purpose. In that moment, the men straightened, their petty arguments forgotten. They saw their leader, really saw him, and recognized the change in him. This wasn't just about protection anymore. This wasn't just about honor or duty. This was about family, and they were going to make it right. The morning sun had barely crept over the horizon when Cade fired up his Harley. 4 of his most trusted men fell in line behind him, their engines creating a thunderous chorus that echoed through the empty streets. The weight of his gun pressed against his lower back, a constant reminder of what might be necessary before the day was done. Miles away, Helen stood in the church kitchen, methodically sorting through donated canned goods. Her fingers traced the labels as she organized them by type, but her mind wandered to the clubhouse, to Cade. The quiet of the church felt suffocating after the lively chaos she'd grown used to. "These green beans can go on the bottom shelf," Pastor Jim's wife suggested gently, noticing Helen's distraction. Helen nodded, forcing herself to focus. "Of course. I'll make sure they're dated properly, too." Throughout the morning, she kept glancing at the phone. Several times, she nearly picked it up to call Cade, to warn him about what she'd overheard. But what could she say? That she was worried? That she missed them all? That leaving felt like a mistake? The afternoon dragged on, heavy with unspoken words. Helen helped dust the pews, arrange flowers for Sunday service, and sort through hymn books. But her heart wasn't in it. Every passing car made her tense. Every shadow at the window caught her attention. On the road, Cade pushed his bike harder, eating up the miles between him and Helen. His men matched his pace, understanding the urgency that drove him. They'd left at first light, but the journey felt endless. As evening approached, Helen stepped out onto the church's small back porch, desperate for fresh air. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. For a moment, she closed her eyes, letting the cool breeze wash over her face. The sound of an engine made her eyes snap open. A black truck turned onto the street, moving slowly. Too slowly. Helen's heart stopped as she recognized the distinctive red stripe along its side, the rival gang's colors. They'd found her. Helen bolted inside, her hands shaking as she locked the back door. "Martha," she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. "Where's Pastor Jim?" "He's at the hospital visiting Mrs. Andrews." Martha appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "What's wrong, dear? You look—" "Call Cade," Helen interrupted, already moving to check the front door's lock. "Please, call him now. They're here." Martha's face went pale, but she grabbed the phone, her trembling fingers dialing the number Cade had left them. Helen could hear the fear in the older woman's voice as she spoke urgently into the receiver. Cade was already less than 15 minutes away when the call came through. His blood turned to ice at Martha's frightened words. He gunned the engine harder, his men following suit as they tore through the darkening streets. Back at the church, Helen heard the sound of boots on the front steps. Martha ushered her toward the kitchen pantry, a small room with a solid door. "Get in, quickly!" Helen slipped inside just as the first crash came from the front of the church. Martha locked the pantry door, whispering, "I'll try to stall them." In the darkness of the pantry, Helen pressed herself against the back wall, surrounded by the smell of canned vegetables and bread. She could hear heavy footsteps, voices, Martha's attempts to reason with the intruders. Her heart hammered so hard she was sure they would hear it. "Please," she whispered, closing her eyes tight. "Please, God, give me courage. Keep them safe. Keep Cade safe." The sound of breaking glass made her flinch. They were inside now. Cade's headlight cut through the growing darkness as he pushed his bike to its limits. The church's steeple came into view, a dark shape against the purple sky. His tires squealed as he took the last turn too fast, not caring about anything except getting to Helen. The crack of splintering wood echoed through the church as Cade's boots hit the ground. He ran toward the front door, gun already drawn, knowing he was seconds away from either saving her or losing her forever. The rival gang broke through the last barrier just as Cade reached the steps. The church foyer erupted into chaos as 3 rival gang members burst through the splintered doorway, their boots thundering against the wooden floors. Come out, little wife!" one of them shouted, his voice echoing off the sacred walls. "We know you're here somewhere." Martha backed away, her hands raised. "Please, this is a house of God." The door crashed open again, but this time it was Cade who filled the frame, his presence commanding even with his weapon pointed downward. His voice carried like thunder through the space. "You'll have to go through me first." The tension crackled as the rivals turned to face him, their own weapons halfway raised. In that frozen moment, Helen emerged from the pantry, her heart pounding but her chin lifted. "Cade!" she called out, her voice trembling but clear. Cade moved like lightning, positioning himself squarely between Helen and the intruders. His broad shoulders formed a human shield as he took another step forward. "Not one more inch," he growled. "You don't touch her." The standoff tightened like a spring about to snap. But then, silent as shadows, Cade's men began filing in through the door. They lined the church walkway, their faces stern but their hands empty, a wall of leather and denim standing in solidarity. No weapons, no threats, just the unmistakable message: you'll have to face all of us. The rival gang members shifted uneasily, suddenly outnumbered. In the distance, police sirens began to wail, growing louder with each passing second. Martha had managed to call 911 before the invasion, and now help was finally arriving. "This ain't over," one of the rivals spat, but his words carried less conviction as red and blue lights began flashing through the stained glass windows. They tried to retreat, but it was too late. Police cars screeched to a halt outside, and officers poured in with weapons drawn, shouting orders. The rivals found themselves surrounded, their escape cut off. As the police took control of the situation, the fight drained from Helen's body. Her knees buckled, and she fell forward into Cade's waiting arms. He caught her easily, holding her close as she broke down in tears of relief and fear. "I'm here," he whispered into her hair, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm not letting you go again. Never again." She clutched his leather jacket, breathing in the familiar scent of motor oil and leather that now meant safety to her. "I was so scared," she admitted softly. "It's over now," he assured her, keeping one arm protectively around her as he watched the officers handcuff the intruders. When the chaos finally settled, Cade led Helen outside to where his motorcycle waited. The evening air had grown cool, and he shrugged off his jacket, wrapping it around her shoulders. 2 police cruisers pulled up alongside them as escort. "Let's go home," he said softly, helping her onto the bike behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, holding tight as they pulled away from the church, red and blue lights flanking them protectively as they headed back to the clubhouse, back home. Sunlight streamed through freshly cleaned windows as Helen stirred awake in Cade's room. The space had been transformed. Gone were the scattered clothes and dusty surfaces. Instead, she found herself surrounded by tidiness and warmth. Her eyes landed on a mason jar filled with wildflowers on the nightstand, a touching gesture from the men who had become her unlikely family. A gentle knock drew her attention to the door. "Helen?" Cade's voice was softer than usual. "Would you like to have breakfast together?" "Come in," she called, sitting up and wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. Cade entered, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. He settled onto the edge of the bed, passing her one of the cups. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, both gathering their thoughts. "I was wrong to send you away," he finally said, staring into his coffee. "I thought I was protecting you, but all I did was make us both miserable." Helen's fingers tightened around her mug. "I understand why you did it. You were scared. We both were." "I've been scared my whole life," Cade admitted, his voice rough with honesty. "Scared of changing, of hoping for better. Then you walked in here with your quiet strength and your gentle heart, and suddenly everything I thought I knew turned upside down. What do you want now?" Helen asked softly. Cade turned to face her fully. "I don't want our marriage to be just a deal anymore. I want a life, a real life, with you. These past weeks have shown me what's possible when someone believes in better things." Later that day, the clubhouse buzzed with activity as community members gathered to celebrate survival and new beginnings. The old building had never felt so alive. Children played in the newly cleaned yard, while adults mingled, sharing food and stories. Helen stood before the crowd, her voice clear and confident as she announced her plans for a literacy program. "Everyone deserves the chance to learn, to grow, to read their own story," she said, smiling at the biker who had first admitted he couldn't read. Cade followed her announcement with one of his own. "The Hells Angels chapter is changing," he declared. "We're becoming a motorcycle outreach group, focused on helping veterans and local families. It's time we used our strength to build up this community instead of causing trouble in it." The news was met with applause and surprised murmurs of approval. Helen watched proudly as Cade's men stood taller, their faces bright with purpose. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the clubhouse floor, Cade took Helen's hand and led her to the piano. The gathering quieted, sensing something important was about to happen. From his pocket, Cade pulled out a small velvet box. Inside gleamed a real wedding ring, simple but beautiful, just like their love story. "Helen," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "will you stay? Not because of any deal or obligation, but because you want to? Because you love me as much as I've grown to love you?" Helen's eyes filled with happy tears as she looked at this man who had changed so much, who had opened his heart to hope and grace. She leaned forward and kissed him softly, pouring all her feelings into that gentle touch. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "This time, I choose you." She turned to the piano, and as her fingers found the keys, music filled the clubhouse once more. But this wasn't just any melody. It was the sound of their future, playing out in a home now built on hope, faith, and a love neither of them had expected to find. If this story made you pause, reflect, or even smile, don't forget to subscribe. I post daily, and the next story might be exactly what you need to hear.